Pleased to present Austin Faith Dialogue, brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries. In the weeks ahead, you will see these and other programs by various denominations. Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs series at the crossroads of religion and life. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues in the area in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC TV. Join us now for this week's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. It's been said that there are two kinds of people in the world. Those who divide the world into two kinds of people, and those who don't. And what about saints and sinners as one way of making that division? Hello, I'm Richard Thompson, pastor of Central Presbyterian Church, and your host for this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. And today we're pleased to have with us an Austin resident and an author of a forthcoming book entitled Saints and Sinners. Lawrence Wright is that writer who's distinguished himself previously in a book that has been published that we'll be talking about, as well as the new one. Larry, we're delighted to have you here today.
Thank you very much.
And I think that before we look at what you're doing now, let's just take a look for a moment at the book that you've done and tell us about how you got into this business in the first place.
The last book was In the New World, and it started out in 1963 on the 1983 on the 20th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, when I went to the editor of Texas Monthly and said that it'd been 20 years and nobody had ever written about what it was like to grow up in Dallas during that time, and to have been there during the assassination, and then to have been from Dallas and from Texas after that event. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote about those experiences in my own experience. And that evolved into a book about growing up in America during that time and during the Vietnam War.
And actually you carried it down through the election of Reagan, as I
Right, it ends in 1984 with Reagan's renomination in Dallas.
And I think doesn't it carry it a little further than that, because I remember the irony that you highlighted Hinckley.
Yeah.
The attempted assassinator of Reagan, who was also from Dallas.
Yes, and he'd been very strongly affected, as I had been, by the Kennedy assassination. In fact, he came home from school that day, very excited, wanted to know what the word assassination meant. Like me, he saved the paper from that day, and but then he took a different road. He eventually bought a rifle just like the one that Oswald used and had it in his collection, and
almost modeling himself.
Very much so. He was a student of assassination, and I think that the irony about Hinckley is that when we were in Dallas, what we all expected was a right-wing nut who was, as the whole country believed it, and we believed it about ourselves, and Hinckley was that creature that we had been fearing, you know, and in a way he was created by that role.
Well, I wonder too about whether there is something that happened with the whole American consciousness at the time of Kennedy's assassination, that we were living in something of an innocent world. Somehow, I mean, Lincoln's assassination was so far back, and despite a couple of world wars in between, that somehow living in an age where we just didn't think that kind of thing could happen here, and it did, and the power and the reality of evil just penetrated the public consciousness in a way that certainly in our generation it hadn't before.
You know, I don't think it was the assassination per se that did that, but the investigation that followed. And the assassination was an evil event. It was a rending event in American history. But the investigation that sliced through American society in a way that we had never seen it exposed before, through all the clandestine agencies, through the personal life of the president, through everything that had been hidden or discreet in the past. Now suddenly we could see the connections between the mob and the CIA and the president and all these women, and and all these motivations emerged, and so we became confused.
Well, I think that the way in which evil unwound itself, in a sense, both by the killing and what happened afterwards, brings us to your book, in a sense, that Saints and Sinners deals with this struggle of good and evil in our time. I'd like to, just in terms of knowing that your book has grown out of or related to a series of articles that you've done. This Texas Monthly is dated January 1988. It has the title on there, Showdown with Walker Raleigh, the Methodist minister in Dallas.
Right.
And the question is, you know, what does your book take off from there in consistent direction?
Well, yes, that story happened to take place in the church that I grew up in Dallas, the First United Methodist Church, and our family was very closely affiliated with that. In fact, the other woman in the Raleigh affair, Lucy Papillon, was the daughter of my minister in that church, Bishop Goodrich. And she had played the piano in my father's Sunday school class that he taught for 14 years, so we were very close to that family. And I had heard Walker Raleigh preach on several occasions, and so going back to the scene of the crime and finding that this was, you know, a highly charged place for me, finding that congregation torn apart by the evil that had taken place inside it, led me to, well, it unsettled me, really. As a reporter, I was off balance because good and evil aren't journalistic terms. They're not categories that I work with. This was a crime story, but there was
and the crime was?
The stranglers, Raleigh's wife, Peggy, was found strangled. He found her and reported her strangled in her garage. And she remains in a coma to this day. And it seems that one of his children was partially strangled as well. The police have been able to determine that Raleigh was lying about his whereabouts. He said he was in the library studying for a sermon, but he made several calls to his answering machine and gave the wrong time and so on. So they've been able to establish that he was lying about where he was during that time. But they have not been able to prove to this potential satisfaction of a jury that he was in the garage strangling his wife at that time.
Okay, so the extent to which the case remains open, nevertheless, the fact that there was the evil perpetrated, and as I read the article, it seems like that, again, that evil perpetuates itself in terms of other ways. Can you bring that out, how you've identified that?
Well, first, no matter whether you think Raleigh was guilty of attempting to murder his wife, he was having an affair with Lucy Papillon, and he was obviously on a journey in the dark side for himself that he was hiding from the congregation. And that information alone was shattering to the congregation. And of course, this is a story that's being replicated in churches all over the country.
Putting the preacher on a pedestal.
Right. And the consequence to the preacher is that he somehow loses hold of his humanity. He becomes an angel, an icon of sorts, and he's not allowed, it doesn't allow himself to embrace those parts of himself that are darker.
And just to make sure that we've got Equal Rights Amendment principles at work here, Amy Semple McPherson is a
classic early example, yes. Yeah.
Woman clergy person, and I mean, as women entered into the ministry, that the same principle involves a beware of either thinking of yourself or letting others think that you're a paragon of virtue.
Yeah. And that was what happened with Raley. He was idolized in his congregation. They thought he did no harm, and that he was pure and perfect, and those aren't human qualities. So, of course, he might have been eager to believe that himself. But I think that what you saw with Raley is that he tried to please people by being perfect. The consequence of that was that the other side of himself,
the dark side,
the darker side, was demanding an audience and an outlet, and he found it.
Oh, that's powerful stuff, though. I mean, the extent to which all of us are, whether in the ministry or not, involved in whether we can acknowledge the evil impulses that are within us, or the evil that we've done. I think that I pick up from this article that it sort of got under your skin, that you said that you suddenly perceived that good and evil were not that far apart.
Well, that was the thing that was frightening. You think that you're doing good. Raley was doing good, but his quest for being perfect was itself a kind of, it's not just a defeated quest, it was, you might almost call it a satanic one. It led him away from being a real person to being a person who is divided into one. This is my interpretation. He hasn't been charged with any crime.
Right.
But he seems to have become a person who was, in public, everything that his congregation wanted him to be, and they adored him for it. And yet he had another side of himself that was darker and was seeking some sort of escape from the prison of perfection that he was captured in.
Well, let's follow your next. After that happened, you've told me that all of a sudden somebody appeared to ask you to do a story on another person of some note.
Coincidentally, right after that, I was asked to do Jimmy Swaggart during his tribulations.
Now, this was in the Rolling Stone.
Right.
And I see it's entitled here, Born to Sin, the Jimmy Swaggart Story. Okay. Now, tell me about how this kind of continued the theme that you were on as you had this earlier story.
Well, Swaggart, once again, a widely loved and adored preacher, but he came from a little town called Faraday, Louisiana, and interestingly, fascinating to me is the fact that his cousins, Jerry Lee Lewis and Mickey Gilley, and then and Jimmy Swaggart, all first cousins, grew up in this little town together, all learned how to play the piano on the same piano, and then Jerry Lee Lewis went on to be, #1 rock and roll player, and Jimmy went on to be #1 gospel, and Mickey to be #1 country, and that's quite a strange accomplishment. But in particular, in the lives of Jerry Lee Lewis and Jimmy Swaggart, you see these two boys early on being groomed to be perfect by their mothers. And what happened with, and Jerry Lee went to seminary here in Waco and was going to be a fundamentalist preacher, as was Jimmy. But Jerry Lee threw that off and rebelled and became, well, he thinks that he's leading his audience to hell through his music. He feels very guilty about it, but he thinks
but
that's
not really enough to change.
Yeah, right. He's living entirely in his shadow.
Yeah.
And Jimmy, on the other hand, became this pure as snow figure.
Angel of light.
Angel of light. And yet was harboring this other side of himself that he couldn't expose to people. He later admitted to the elders in his church that he had been a sexual pervert since the age of 10. So that was the other side of him that we weren't allowed to see. But in public, you had one cousin who was the angel of the Lord, and the other who was the agent of the devil. And so there's this interesting split off where they were each living these incredibly powerful symbolic lives.
Well, the thing that, of course, has made the public aware of what you're talking about is Swiggert's fall from all of his power and all of the money and all of the many TV shows, both in this land and abroad. I mean, he came to be probably at the top of the charts as far as the religion business was concerned.
I didn't realize how true that was until I got into the story. I thought, you know, Swaggart, Falwell, Robinson are all about the same level, but once you get out of the United States, it's a different story. He was the most widely televised human in the world, and he was on in more than 100 countries, Mongolia and Madagascar. You know, he was translated into 16 languages. He was a worldwide phenomenon, and he believed that he alone had been designated to save humanity before the apocalypse.
Well, you know, one of the things that comes to mind is built into the mythology of our culture is that Satan is a fallen angel. That there's so much good, so much power, so much of God in, you know, originally back in Old Testament times, they thought part of the heavenly hosts, right up there along with the other archangels and so on, but fell. And that as a fallen angel, evil, Satan, however you describe it, has got all this good that's just run amok or has not been able to apply itself to good purposes, but to the dark side. And, you know, as you described Swaggart, he wouldn't have had that power to reach out so far unless there was a lot of really good stuff there. And that the fact, I'm inferring from what you say, that insofar as he couldn't come to terms with those evil impulses, he either denied that or had to keep up that appearance from his mama to his flock, to his world audience, that then he became beholden to that power. Is that, am I reading too much into what you're saying?
No, I think, well, from his point of view, no. I think, you know, he lived on those terms. Those are exactly the kind of terms that he would look at it. I think he's even bigger than that in a way. I feel that given his beliefs, if he believed on the one hand that that he alone had been anointed by God to have this worldwide ministry to save humanity, and at the same time that he was beholden to the demons inside him. If you're a Pentecostal fundamentalist preacher, who are you? Well, that particular equation adds up to the Antichrist. And, you know, I'm not sure that, I don't see him as the Antichrist. I see him as an unhappy, tortured man. But I think that he might have seen himself in those terms.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, too, that I just, in order to give the public a sense of what your book will encompass, I know you have a chapter on Madalyn Murray O'Hair, the article that you wrote about her, and I think it was Texas Monthly.
That's right.
Said that, ironically, she's a religious person. It's like the antimatter in relation to matter. I think you said it's the black hole of spirituality, in a sense. And then you picked up on a person out in, I think, California, Anton LaVey.
Yes.
We have a quote that is connected to your article here. We might be able to share that I think brings it out. It's not easy being evil in a world that's gone to hell. And that your interviews with him and experience, I guess you had a couple of weeks to do that story. How would you come away from that experience with this quote in mind and carry it forward?
Well, I was curious to look at someone who advertised themselves as being all evil. I've been writing about these people who promoted themselves as being all good, and so I was curious to see what this kind of person would be like in comparison.
Now, LaVey is the founder of a Satan cult or something like that.
He's the founder of the Church of Satan, which he established in 1965 in San Francisco. And he's the author of the Satanic Bible, which is it's sold more than 600,000 copies to date. It's a very popular book among a lot of young people. It outsells the Bible in many cities. And he's a cult figure.
Best known for his conversion of Jane Mansfield, I guess.
Well, right, and his purported liaisons with Marilyn Monroe and people like that. But I found with him that, ironically enough, he's very ascetic. He's not. He talks an evil game, but essentially he's a very confined person. He's a bookworm. His habits are. You know, any monk in a Franciscan friary would praise his particular habits. I mean, he doesn't no coffee, he doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he doesn't take drugs. He'll take a single Excedrin during the day for a little lift, and you know that's a vice that he will allow.
This is supposed to be the epitome of evil that we're expecting just horns and a tail and all of this.
Well, he used to wear horns and tails, and you know, during his ceremonies and so on. And I think here was a person who wanted to live entirely in the dark side. And there's an ancient, I guess it's a Wiccan idea, that there are two paths to salvation, the left-hand path and the right-hand path, and that either one is purifying in its way. And I think that that LaVey embodies the truth of that particular observation.
And the fact that he's really not able to pull it off. I mean, I've read an article, I remember in a report soon after this became known to the public that made the statement, it's really difficult. In fact, it seems to be impossible to be consistently 24 hours a day evil. It takes too much effort. It's just beyond human capacity to stay bad all the time. And it seems like he's almost admitting that he can't do it.
Well, I think it'd be exhausting and lonely. He was one of the things about him. He's a good family man, and you know, he raised 2 daughters, and he was divorced from his first wife, and he's currently going through a palimony suit with his second companion. But his daughters are not the wreckage that people would expect from, you know, being raised by a satanic family.
Yeah. And one final thing that comes to mind, too, in that regard is St. Augustine, who made the statement that evil is by its nature parasitic. It depends on the good for its existence. And he made his case for God on that basis, that by its nature, the evil is derivative, whereas the good is the original. And I know you've got another chapter you're working on about the Matthew Fox, who's, I think, grew up in an Augustine tradition and is sort of reacting against that in some ways in terms of original blessing.
Right. He's a Dominican Catholic priest, and he lives in Oakland, California, and he was silenced in 1988 for a year because of his controversial, unorthodox writings and teachings. He's a fascinating theologian, and not just a theologian. He's a kind of spiritual adventurer, you know. And
I'd like to let you follow out on that. We may have to have you back on another program once this book is out and we get some chance to get some feedback on it. But I know that another one that's an adventurer that you name that you seem to have an affinity for is Will Campbell. In the time that we have, why don't we just focus on Campbell in terms of why you find him intriguing?
Well,
and who he is.
Will Campbell, Southern Baptist preacher, lives in Tennessee. I first met him when I was a young reporter at the Race Relations Reporter in Nashville, Tennessee. Will, at that time, was a legend in the civil rights movement. I didn't know it. I was just, first day on the job, this odd-looking, eccentric Ichabod Crane, but short type of figure.
Yale Divinity School graduate, nevertheless.
You wouldn't have known it, given the apparition that walked into my office and took off this Amish hat that he was wearing and asked me to cut his hair. And there was scarcely any of it, so it wasn't much of a task. But
hadn't he marched with Martin Luther King? And
he had been the only white man in the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with King. He had marched with the children in the 1957 attempt to integrate Central High and Little Rock, and had been a formidable and important figure in the civil rights movement.
So the segregationists were really down on him, and yet in recent days I understand he's been a defender of people in the Ku Klux Klan.
Well, when Stokely Carmichael told the whites to get out of the movement, he told Will to go back and organize his own people. And Will said, well, I can't do that. That's the Ku Klux Klan. You know, he grew up in a little farm in southern Mississippi, Liberty, Mississippi. And Stokely told him, well, who do you think needs it more? And so the truth of that statement struck Campbell very powerfully. Plus, something else that had happened to him. Early on in his ministry, he had formulated this, a friend asked him in 10 words or less to define what Christianity is. And Campbell's formulation was, we're all bastards, but God loves us anyway. Now, after he made that statement, a friend of his, Jonathan Daniel, who was a theology student, was down in Mississippi on a civil rights mission, and went into a store with a priest and a couple of other friends to buy a moon pie and an RC Cola. And because it was a black store and some of the people he was with were black, this was suspect, and so he was shotgunned to death by the sheriff there. And Campbell was deeply grieving for this, and the friend that he had told said, well, was that sheriff a bastard? And, you know, that was easy enough to agree to. Well, was your friend Jonathan a bastard? And that was hard. And he said, and which one of those bastards do you think God loves the most?
Well, I think that recognition of how he recognizes the dark side of himself, comes to term with that, is a sign that something of maybe what you bring to us is what a saint means in relation to a sinner, and we're delighted to have had you share this with us, Larry Wright. We look forward to seeing your book.
Thank you, Rich.
You folks join us next week for Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm Richard Thompson. Peace be with you. For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472-7627.